There was in the village of Rosehill a general agreement that nothing truly dreadful could happen on a Saturday in June. The roses were out. The church bells had rung with cheerful determination all morning. White clouds drifted lazily above the Surrey hills, and the village fete upon the lawn of Greyfriars Hall promised every respectable pleasure that English country life could offer. Sponge cakes beneath striped tents, cucumber sandwiches curling delicately at the edges, children shrieking near the hoopla stall, and ladies in flowered hats discussing jam competitions with grave intensity. At precisely 2:30, Miss Jane Marple arrived through the side gate carrying a small basket of knitted garments for the parish stall. She moved slowly, as elderly ladies do, but her pale blue eyes missed very little. "My dear Miss Marple!" cried Mrs. Bantry, descending upon her in a cloud of lavender water and chiffon. "You are late, which means either rheumatism or scandal. Which is it?" "Neither, I hope," said Miss Marple gently, "though I did meet the grocer's boy bicycling rather recklessly, which often leads to one or the other." Mrs. Bantry laughed. "You always make ordinary things sound ominous." "That is because ordinary things so often are," said Miss Marple. The remark passed unnoticed, as such remarks from Miss Marple frequently did. The fete spread across the grounds of Greyfriars Hall, the old stone residence belonging to Mr. Arthur Wexley, who had inherited both the estate and a considerable amount of debt from a distinguished but financially incompetent uncle. The hall itself stood behind clipped hedges and ancient yew trees, dignified despite its slight air of decline. Near the fountain the vicar's wife supervised the raffle table with military vigilance. At the tea marquee Colonel Melbury complained loudly about modern taxes. Children darted between adults carrying paper windmills, and everywhere there was gossip. Rosehill, like all villages, lived upon it. "There's trouble at Greyfriars," whispered Mrs. Finch to her companion beside the cake stool. "Nonsense, I assure you. Cook told Elsie Parker that Mr. Wexley intends to sell the South Gardens. The greenhouse as well?" "Especially the greenhouse." This caused proper alarm. The greenhouse at Greyfriars was famous locally. A vast Victorian structure of iron and glass stretching behind the hall, it housed rare orchids, climbing vines, and exotic plants gathered decades earlier by Arthur Wexley's grandfather during imperial expeditions abroad. Villagers visited it every summer during the fete, and many considered it the true jewel of the estate. "It would be criminal," declared Mrs. Finch. "Financial desperation often appears criminal," murmured Miss Marple, who had paused nearby arranging knitted scarves. Mrs. Finch blinked. "Do you think Mr. Wexley is desperate?" "My dear Mrs. Finch," said Miss Marple mildly, "men who are comfortable do not develop lines beside the mouth overnight." Mrs. Finch immediately turned to inspect Arthur Wexley from afar. He stood near the archery lawn speaking to a dark-haired woman in a green silk dress. She was perhaps 35, handsome in a dramatic way, not entirely suited to village life. Her name was Vivian Harcourt, recently arrived from London and staying, according to uncertain reports, as a guest at Greyfriars Hall. Rosehill disapproved of uncertainty. Vivian smoked cigarettes in public, drove a motor car too quickly, and had once remarked during church tea that she found hymns depressingly repetitive. This alone had nearly ruined her socially. "She's the sort," whispered Mrs. Finch darkly, "who brings tragedy wherever she goes." Miss Marple made no answer. She was watching another figure instead. Mr. Lionel Crewe, the village solicitor, emerged from the direction of the greenhouse carrying a leather document case. He was a thin, nervous man with precise hair and spectacles forever sliding down his nose. As he crossed the lawn, Arthur Wexley intercepted him sharply. Even at a distance, the tension between them was unmistakable. "You promised me until autumn," Wexley said in a low, strained voice. Crewe replied something inaudible. "You cannot simply spring this upon me publicly." "Lower your voice," hissed Crewe. Vivian Harcourt turned away, pretending not to listen. Miss Marple's knitting needles paused. Human beings, she often thought, resembled plants more than they realized. Under pressure, their true nature forced itself visibly to the surface. Before she could continue the thought, a cheerful young man appeared beside her carrying lemonade. "Miss Marple!" "Allow me." It was Dr. Julian Fielding, Rosehill's new physician, whose youth and good looks had already caused considerable disturbance among the unmarried ladies under 40. "You are very kind," said Miss Marple. "I've been ordered about all day by Mrs. Bantry." She says village fetes survive entirely upon exploited bachelors. A wise woman. Dr. Fielding laughed and glanced toward the greenhouse. Have you been through it yet? Remarkable place, though I confess it gives me the oddest feeling. In what way? He hesitated, as though someone were watching. Miss Marple looked at him thoughtfully. Greenhouses are curious places, she said. Everything grows larger there than it should. At 4 o'clock the prizes were awarded. At 4:15 the rain began unexpectedly, and at precisely 22 minutes past 4 the screaming started. It came from the direction of the greenhouse. For one suspended instant the fete froze completely. Teacups halted halfway to lips. Children stopped running. A plate shattered somewhere upon the grass. Then everyone moved at once. Miss Marple did not run. Elderly ladies never do. But she walked with surprising quickness behind the crowd surging toward the gardens. Rain tapped sharply against the glass roof of the greenhouse. Inside the air was damp and heavy with earth, orchids, and something else beneath it all, a metallic scent unmistakable to anyone who had encountered violence before. A young maid stood near the entrance, weeping hysterically.
"Oh, God, oh, God."
"What happened?" demanded Colonel Melbury. The girl pointed wordlessly inward. They saw him then. Lionel Crewe lay sprawled beside the central stone pathway beneath the hanging ferns. One arm twisted awkwardly beneath him. His spectacles had fallen several feet away, and protruding from his chest was a narrow gardening knife. For several seconds nobody spoke. Rain hammered the glass overhead. Water trickled slowly down the interior panes like tears. Then Mrs. Finch gave a little choking cry and fainted neatly into the begonias. Dr. Fielding pushed forward immediately, kneeling beside the body. But after only a brief examination he looked up gravely. "I'm afraid he's dead." A murmur rippled through the greenhouse like wind through leaves. Arthur Wexley had gone utterly white. Vivian Harcourt stared fixedly at the corpse, one gloved hand pressed against her mouth. The vicar began murmuring prayers under his breath, and Miss Marple stood very still near the rear orchids, her eyes moving quietly from face to face, noticing, always noticing. There were small things, tiny things, the overturned flower pot near the eastern bench, mud upon the dead man's right cuff but not his left, a broken sprig of rosemary crushed near the pathway, and one thing more, something so slight nobody else appeared to see it. Condensation covered the greenhouse glass from end to end because of the sudden rain and heat within. Yet upon the inside of the farthest pane, partially obscured by ivy leaves, someone had traced a single word with a finger. Not written recently, perhaps, but still visible. Miss Marple frowned faintly. Very often, she reflected, murder began long before anyone died. Outside, Rose Hill's fete dissolved into frightened clusters of whispering villagers. Inside the greenhouse, among the orchids and whetstone pathways, the first shadow of suspicion settled quietly over them all. By 6 o'clock that evening, the entire village of Rose Hill had divided itself into 3 distinct groups: those who claimed they had always distrusted Lionel Crewe, those who insisted the murder must have been committed by an outsider, and those who privately believed the affair involved something immoral and therefore deeply interesting. In villages these categories often overlapped. Rain continued steadily after the fete had been abandoned. Water streamed from gutters and gathered in shining pools along the lanes. Curtains twitched discreetly in cottage windows as neighbors crossed from house to house carrying information of varying accuracy. By supper-time, Mr. Pritchard the butcher had confidently declared that Crewe had been poisoned before being stabbed. At 7:30, Mrs. Ellis announced that the dead solicitor had been blackmailing half the county. By 8 o'clock, someone suggested foreign anarchists. Miss Marple, seated beside the fire in her sitting-room, listened to none of it directly. But village gossip, like smoke, had a way of entering everywhere. She sat with a basket of mending upon her lap while her companion, Miss Elspeth Harmon, poured tea with visible agitation. "It is simply dreadful," declared Elspeth. "Right in the greenhouse, during a church fete. One would think there are limits." "My dear Elspeth," said Miss Marple gently, "human wickedness rarely considers social appropriateness." Elspeth shivered. "And that word on the glass, you do think it means something?" Miss Marple threaded her needle carefully. "Most things mean something. The difficulty lies in deciding what." The word ghost had already spread through the village with extraordinary speed. By now it had acquired several imaginative additions. Some claimed the letters appeared in blood. Others insisted they vanished moments after the body was found. In truth, Inspector Daniel Hewitt had examined the glass personally before anyone touched it. The inspector was a broad-shouldered man from Much Benham Police Division, practical by temperament and deeply suspicious of theatrics. He had little patience for village hysteria and even less for amateur speculation. At that moment he sat in Arthur Wexley's library at Greyfriars Hall, removing rainwater from his hat with a handkerchief while Sergeant Pike took notes nearby. Arthur Wexley stood beside the fireplace holding a whiskey glass with unsteady fingers. "I've told you everything already," he said irritably. "Humor me, sir," replied Hewitt. "You argued with the deceased shortly before he died." "Yes." "About what?" "Financial matters." "What financial matters?" Wexley hesitated. The inspector noticed immediately. "Mr. Wexley?" The younger man gave an impatient sigh. "Greyfriars is in difficulty. Crewe handled the estate accounts. Certain loans were being called in." "By him personally?" "No, confound it, through the bank. But you quarreled. Anyone would quarrel under the circumstances." Inspector Hewitt made a note. "And Miss Harcourt?" At once something changed in Wexley's expression. "Vivian Harcourt had that effect upon men." "She has nothing to do with this." "I did not say she had. She's merely staying here temporarily." "So I understand." Hewitt understood considerably more than he said aloud. Across the room, Vivian herself lounged near the window, smoking with elegant composure. Only the slight tremor in her hand betrayed strain. "I suppose," she said coolly, "you intend to interrogate the entire county before breakfast. Only the people present at the murder scene. How efficient!" Her tone irritated the inspector instantly. "Where were you between 4 and half past?" "In the rose garden." "Alone? No one saw you?" She smiled faintly. "That is generally what being alone means, Inspector." Sergeant Pike coughed to hide amusement. Hewitt ignored him. "And your relationship with Mr. Crewe?" "Unpleasant." "Why?" "Because he enjoyed disapproving of me." The inspector studied her carefully. Beautiful women often complicated murder investigations. Men lied for them. Women lied about them. Facts became entangled with emotions. "Did he threaten you in any way?" Vivian flicked ash delicately into a tray. "He threatened everyone. That was his profession. Before." Hewitt could continue. The butler entered quietly. "Miss Marple to see you, sir." Arthur Wexley looked startled. "Miss Marple." "Show her in," said Inspector Hewitt unexpectedly. A moment later Miss Marple entered carrying a damp umbrella and wearing the mild expression of someone arriving for entirely ordinary tea. "Forgive the intrusion," she said. "Mrs. Bantry insisted I should return her shawl immediately, and as I was passing—" Nobody believed this for an instant. Inspector Hewitt rose politely. He knew Miss Marple by reputation, though he regarded that reputation cautiously. Elderly ladies who solved crimes made him professionally uncomfortable. "Miss Marple." "How do you do, Inspector?" Her eyes drifted calmly about the room, absorbing everything. Arthur Wexley's strained exhaustion, Vivian Harcourt's defensive elegance, the half-empty whiskey decanter, and on the writing desk near the window a torn envelope beside several legal papers hastily turned face down. Miss Marple sat quietly when offered a chair. "So tragic," she murmured. "Poor Mr. Crewe." "He was not universally beloved," said Vivian dryly. "No," Miss Marple agreed. "People who know uncomfortable things seldom are." Inspector Hewitt leaned forward slightly. "You believe he knew something important?" Miss Marple smiled vaguely. "My dear Inspector, solicitors always do. That word in the greenhouse, what do you make of it?" "Very little yet, but something." She folded her hands. "The difficulty with dramatic clues is that they are usually intended to distract from quieter ones." The inspector's eyebrows rose. "And what quieter things have you noticed?" "Oh, trifles." Miss Marple glanced toward the rain-dark windows. "For example, it struck me as curious that Mr. Crewe had mud upon only one cuff." No one answered immediately. "Meaning?" Hewitt asked at last. "Well," said Miss Marple delicately, "if a person falls naturally forward, one generally expects rather symmetrical untidiness. Human beings are surprisingly balanced creatures." The inspector stared at her. "You think the body was moved?" "I merely think," said Miss Marple, "that gardeners know how difficult it is to transplant things successfully." And with that entirely unhelpful remark she rose. "I mustn't keep you from your work." After she had gone, silence lingered briefly in the library. Then Sergeant Pike muttered, "She notices odd things." Inspector Hewitt grunted, but privately he wrote down every word she had said. The following morning dawned pale and washed clean after rain. Rose Hill awoke hungry for developments. Milk deliveries took twice their normal length because every doorstep conversation returned inevitably to murder. At the post office, Mrs. Keating whispered that police dogs were arriving from London. At the bakery, someone claimed hidden jewels had been discovered at Greyfriars. Meanwhile, Miss Marple walked quietly through the village lanes carrying a basket of early sweet peas. She paused outside the cottage of Mrs. Ivy Bell, formerly parlourmaid at Greyfriars Hall, and currently the greatest living authority on everyone else's business. Mrs. Bell answered the door instantly, as though waiting. "Well," she exclaimed, "terrible business." "Yes, indeed," said Miss Marple. "I wondered how poor Mr. Wexley was bearing up." Mrs. Bell lowered her voice immediately. "Badly, and no wonder." "No wonder?" Miss Marple waited. Mrs. Bell required no encouragement. "Arguments, money difficulties, Mr. Crewe coming and going at all hours, and that woman." "Miss Harcourt?" Mrs. Bell sniffed. "A respectable house changes when such women arrive." Miss Marple said thoughtfully, "Men can change houses quite remarkably too." Mrs. Bell considered this unexpected fairness with suspicion. Perhaps, but Mr. Crewe disliked her strongly. Did he? He told Mr. Wexley she'd ruin him. Interesting, thought Miss Marple. Very interesting. Because hatred, she knew, was rarely inspired by charm alone. As she departed, her attention drifted toward Greyfriars Hall, visible beyond the trees. Morning sunlight glimmered faintly upon the distant greenhouse glass, and suddenly she remembered something Dr. Fielding had said the previous afternoon. As though someone were watching. Miss Marple stopped walking. A curious thought had come into her mind. Greenhouses trapped heat, moisture, smells, and sometimes secrets. She turned slowly back toward the hall. There were one or two things she wished to see again very carefully indeed. The greenhouse at Greyfriars Hall possessed a different character in morning light. During the fete it had seemed almost tropical lush, crowded, alive with perfume and chatter. But now, beneath a pale sky and the lingering dampness after rain, it felt strangely deserted. Water still clung to the glass panes in dull silver streaks, and the heavy scent of soil and orchids hung motionless in the warm air. Miss Marple paused just inside the entrance. Inspector Hewitt had permitted her visit with visible reluctance. "You are not to touch anything," he had said firmly. "My dear Inspector," Miss Marple had replied mildly, "elderly ladies are forever being told not to touch things. We become quite practiced at obedience." Sergeant Pike, who was present during the exchange, had abruptly developed a cough suspiciously similar to laughter. Now the greenhouse stood silent except for the faint ticking drip of condensation. Police examination had disturbed very little. A chalk outline still marked the spot where Lionel Crewe's body had lain beside the central pathway. Nearby, the overturned flower-pot remained where it had fallen. Miss Marple moved slowly forward. There was something theatrical about greenhouses, she reflected. They encouraged exaggeration. Flowers bloomed too brightly. Vines spread too greedily. Heat intensified every scent and emotion. Human beings behaved similarly when enclosed too long together. She paused beside the eastern bench. The broken rosemary sprig had been removed, but several crushed leaves still remained between the stones. Miss Marple bent carefully, studying them, not stepped upon accidentally. As though by someone turning sharply, she straightened again. At the far end of the greenhouse stood the pane upon which the word ghost had appeared. The letters were fainter now. Condensation had dried unevenly, leaving only a pale trace visible beneath the ivy. Miss Marple regarded it thoughtfully. Not written in panic, not written by a dying man. Too deliberate, and oddly placed. A person collapsing from a stab wound would scarcely wander across the greenhouse to leave mysterious messages on glass. Real death, Miss Marple knew, was generally untidy and disappointingly practical. Number. The word had been intended to be found. But why ghost? Her attention shifted suddenly upward. Above the pane hung a narrow iron ventilation latch, slightly open despite the rain. Very interesting indeed. A voice behind her said sharply, "You seem very occupied, Miss Marple." Inspector Hewitt approached along the path, notebook in hand. "I was admiring the orchids," said Miss Marple. "Really?" "No," she admitted pleasantly. "Not entirely." The inspector folded his arms. "You believe the message was planted?" "I believe," said Miss Marple, "that murderers who attempt cleverness often overestimate the dramatic instincts of their victims." Hewitt grunted. "That sounds like agreement." Miss Marple smiled faintly. The inspector walked toward the pane. "Our experts say the word may have been written hours earlier." "You expected that?" "The condensation interested me." "How?" "Well," said Miss Marple, "one notices such things when keeping conservatory plants. If the word had been traced during yesterday afternoon, after the rain began, the moisture would have gathered differently around the finger marks." Hewitt stared. "You deduced that from gardening?" "My dear Inspector, gardening teaches one nearly everything about human nature eventually." The inspector was beginning to suspect this was true. He changed direction abruptly. "There's another matter. We found this in Crewe's pocket." He produced a folded paper. Miss Marple accepted it carefully. The note was brief, typed rather than handwritten. "Meet me in the greenhouse at 4 o'clock. It concerns the past. Come alone." No signature. "How intriguing," murmured Miss Marple. "You see the implication. Someone lured him there deliberately." Miss Marple returned the paper. "Perhaps." The inspector frowned. "You disagree?" "I merely wonder why a cautious man would obey such a note. He may have recognized the subject matter." "Precisely." Inspector Hewitt studied her face. "You think the past referred to something specific?" Miss Marple's gaze wandered toward the orchids again. "In villages," she said softly, "the past rarely disappears. It simply changes rooms." Before the inspector could press further, footsteps approached outside. Dr. Julian Fielding entered carrying his medical bag. "Morning," he said. "Am I interrupting?" "Not at all," replied Hewitt. "You examined the body first. I've additional questions." Fielding nodded easily enough, though Miss Marple noticed faint shadows beneath his eyes. "You didn't sleep well," she observed. The young doctor smiled tiredly. "Small villages become surprisingly noisy after murders." "Indeed they do." Hewitt opened his notebook. "You stated yesterday that death was nearly instantaneous." "Yes." "The knife entered directly between the ribs. Could Crewe have moved afterward?" "Not far." Miss Marple glanced quietly toward the distant pane of glass. "Not far." Dr. Fielding noticed her expression. "Something wrong?" "Not wrong," said Miss Marple gently. "Merely incomplete." The doctor looked puzzled. Inspector Hewitt closed his notebook abruptly. "Come along, then. Since everyone seems determined to hint instead of speaking plainly, perhaps we might try directness for a change." Miss Marple appeared slightly startled. "How refreshing. Did Crewe write the message or not?" "No." "Why?" "Because men of his type do not indulge in melodrama shortly before death." "That's hardly evidence." "No," agreed Miss Marple. "Only experience." The inspector exhaled impatiently. "You speak as though personality were forensic science." "My dear Inspector," said Miss Marple, "personality is forensic science." For a moment nobody spoke. Then Dr. Fielding said unexpectedly, "I think she's right." Hewitt turned. The young doctor shrugged faintly. Crewe wasn't theatrical. He was cold, methodical, a man who frightened others quietly. Miss Marple regarded him thoughtfully. "You knew him fairly well?" "I treated him once or twice." "And liked him?" "No." The answer came too quickly. Fielding seemed aware of it at once. "I mean, he wasn't easy company?" Inspector Hewitt's eyes narrowed slightly. Miss Marple noticed, and stored the observation carefully away. Later that afternoon the rain finally cleared. Sunlight spilled across Rosehill's wet lanes, drawing villagers back outdoors in cautious clusters. Miss Marple took tea with Mrs. Bantry in the drawing-room at Gossington Cottage, where discussion of murder proceeded with considerable enthusiasm. "My dear," declared Miss Bantry, "it's exactly like one of those dreadful sensation novels Raymond leaves lying about." "Real murder is usually much less tidy," said Miss Marple. "But surely someone at Greyfriars knows something." "Almost certainly." Miss Bantry leaned forward eagerly. "And the woman?" "Miss Harcourt?" "Yeah." "She has beautiful shoulders." "That type always complicates matters." Miss Marple hid a smile. "Beauty often encourages people to behave foolishly." "Men, you mean?" "Mostly." Mrs. Bantry lowered her voice. "I heard from the vicar's wife that Lionel Crewe opposed Arthur Wexley marrying her. Did he indeed?" "Apparently there were dreadful quarrels." Miss Marple stirred her tea slowly. Marriage, money difficulties, a dead solicitor, and a message about the past. Pieces were beginning to arrange themselves, though not yet clearly. "Do you know," said Miss Marple thoughtfully, "this reminds me very much of a man in St. Mary Mead who cultivated prize delphiniums." Mrs. Bantry blinked. "How extraordinary!" "He cheated constantly," Miss Marple continued calmly. Swapped labels, altered soil mixtures, bribed judges in tiny ways. Everyone assumed him harmless because he adored flowers. What happened? One day his wife poisoned him. Mrs. Bantry nearly dropped her teacup. My dear Jane. Yeah. Quite shocking. Though afterwards one realized she had been living inside deceit for nearly 20 years, she set down her spoon gently. That is the difficulty with secrets. People imagine they remain buried. In reality, they continue growing underground. Outside, beyond the cottage windows, the late sunlight touched the distant glass roof of the Greyfriars greenhouse. For just an instant it flashed brilliantly, and Miss Marple, watching it, experienced the sudden, unmistakable feeling that somewhere within that glittering structure lay not merely the scene of a murder, but the reason for it. On the Tuesday following the murder, Rose Hill awoke beneath a sky of low grey cloud and a mood of subdued excitement. The newspapers had arrived. Nothing stimulates an English village more thoroughly than discovering itself in print. By 9 o'clock, copies of the Daily Chronicle and the Surrey Advertiser had spread across breakfast tables throughout the district. The headlines were gratifyingly dramatic. Murder at Country Fair. Mystery of the greenhouse death. Solicitor slain at Greyfriars Hall. Mrs. Finch declared the reports vulgar but read them twice. Colonel Melbury complained that journalists exaggerated everything while clipping out one article for future reference. And at the Bluebell tea rooms, villagers gathered in cautious knots pretending not to discuss the matter while discussing nothing else. Miss Marple sat near the window with her tea and toast, knitting quietly. From this position she observed nearly everyone entering the establishment. People often reveal themselves most clearly when attempting discretion. At 9:30, Arthur Wexley arrived. He looked exhausted. His clothes were immaculate, but the careful grooming only emphasized the strain beneath it. He paused upon seeing Miss Marple and then crossed reluctantly toward her table. "Good morning." "Good morning, Mr. Wexley. May I sit down?" "Of course." He removed his gloves slowly. For a few moments neither spoke. The waitress brought coffee. Outside, bicycles passed through the square, and somewhere nearby a dog barked impatiently. At last Wexley said abruptly, "The police believe I killed Crewe." Miss Marple continued knitting. "That must be uncomfortable." He gave a short laugh. "You sound unsurprised. My dear Mr. Wexley, police generally suspect the person who quarreled publicly with the victim shortly before death. It saves time. You think they're wrong?" Miss Marple glanced up mildly. "Are they?" Something flickered in his face, then not guilt exactly, but fear. Fear of something larger than accusation. "I didn't kill him," he said quietly. Miss Marple waited. "He was ruining me, certainly. But murder?" He shook his head. "I'm not made for violence." "No," said Miss Marple softly. "I do not think you are." The relief in his expression appeared almost painful. Then, after a hesitation, he leaned forward. "There's something else." "Yes?" "He'd become frightened recently." Miss Marple's needles paused. "Mr. Crewe? That is interesting. I noticed it about 2 weeks ago. He kept checking windows during conversations, avoiding certain subjects. Once he asked whether strangers had been seen near the hall. Did he explain why?" "No." Wexley rubbed tiredly at his forehead. "I assumed it involved money somehow. Crewe dealt with unpleasant people occasionally. But you no longer think so." "No." "Why?" Wexley looked toward the rain-dark window. "Because the day before he died, he asked me a peculiar question." Miss Marple said nothing. "He asked whether the greenhouse still had the old rear entrance." This time her knitting stopped completely. "The rear entrance, a small side door near the potting sheds. It's been locked for years." "Locked? Who has the key?" "I do." "Or rather—" He frowned suddenly. "I thought I did." Miss Marple regarded him steadily. "You are no longer certain?" "No." A silence settled between them. The waitress refilled cups nearby. At another table Mrs. Finch lowered her newspaper conspicuously in order to overhear better. Miss Marple resumed knitting. "Fear," she said thoughtfully, "is often far more revealing than hatred." Wexley looked at her sharply. "What do you mean?" "Hate is simple. Fear suggests knowledge." Before he could reply, the bell above the tea-room door jingled. Vivian Harcourt entered. Conversation throughout the room altered subtly at once. Not silence exactly, but awareness. She wore a dark tailored coat, and carried herself with the composed elegance of a woman accustomed to scrutiny. Yet Miss Marple noticed immediately that she too appeared tired. Vivian saw Wexley and crossed toward them. "So here you are." Her tone carried irritation beneath its smoothness. "You vanished this morning. I needed air. You need a solicitor." "I had one," said Wexley bitterly. A flicker crossed Vivian's face. She sat down without invitation. Miss Marple observed quietly while the younger woman removed her gloves. Beautiful hands, carefully controlled, but anxious. Very anxious indeed. "You been speaking to the police again?" Vivian asked. "Yes." "And?" "They asked the same questions. They always do." Miss Marple said gently, "Inspector Hewitt appears very thorough." Vivian gave a cool smile. "How diplomatic." "My experience of policemen," said Miss Marple, "is that thoroughness frequently disguises uncertainty." For the first time Vivian looked genuinely interested. "You don't think they know who did it?" "My dear, if they knew, villages would become unbearably dull." Unexpectedly Vivian laughed. The sound transformed her face entirely, softening it. And Miss Marple thought, there is kindness in her after all. That, too, was interesting, because villages prefer women to fit neatly into categories. Dangerous women are expected to remain dangerous consistently. Human beings seldom cooperate with such arrangements. Wexley rose abruptly. "I must go back." Vivian stood as well. "We'll drive together." He hesitated, then nodded. As they departed, Miss Marple noticed something very small. Vivian touched Wexley's sleeve lightly as they passed through the doorway, not seductively, protectively. That afternoon Inspector Hewitt arrived at Miss Marple's cottage carrying damp irritation and official papers. "You were right," he announced without preamble. "How gratifying," said Miss Marple. "About which particular thing?" "The greenhouse door." He removed his hat. The rear entrance had been opened recently. Miss Marple folded her hands. "We found traces of mud outside the potting sheds, also scratches near the lock. Forced? Possibly." The inspector began pacing. "What bothers me is timing. If someone entered through that door, they avoided the fete crowds entirely. Which suggests planning." Hewitt stopped abruptly. "You sound unsurprised again." "My dear Inspector, murders committed impulsively during church festivities are comparatively rare." He ignored this. "There's more. Crewe received several anonymous letters during the past month." "Not exactly." He handed her copies. The notes were short, printed crudely from newspaper clippings. "You know what happened. The dead remember. The greenhouse sees everything." Miss Marple read them carefully. Then once again. At length she said, "How theatrical. That's your observation?" "Yeah." Hewitt stared at her in disbelief. "Someone stalked the man with anonymous messages referencing the greenhouse and the dead, and you call it theatrical?" "My dear Inspector, truly dangerous people seldom advertise beforehand. It attracts attention unnecessarily." He sat down heavily. "Then what do you think this means?" Miss Marple looked toward the window where rain touched the glass softly. "I think someone wanted Lionel Crewe frightened, and succeeded." She handed back the letters. "But fear is a curious thing. Sometimes people fear punishment, sometimes exposure." "And sometimes ghosts," said Hewitt dryly. Miss Marple smiled faintly. "In my experience, Inspector, ghosts are usually another name for memory." The inspector was silent a moment. Then he said quietly, "There's something else I haven't released publicly." "Yes? The knife? What about it?" "It came from the greenhouse potting bench." Miss Marple's eyes sharpened almost imperceptibly. "You see something?" "Possibly." "Why?" But Miss Marple did not answer immediately. Instead, she rose and crossed slowly toward the fireplace. "A local weapon," she murmured. "Chosen in haste, perhaps, unless intended to appear so." Hewitt frowned. "You suspect premeditation still?" "I suspect," said Miss Marple softly, "that somebody wished the murder to look emotional." The inspector leaned forward. "Why?" Miss Marple turned back toward him. "Because emotional crimes are wonderfully untidy, and untidiness conceals detail." Outside, the church clock struck 4, the very hour Lionel Crewe had entered the greenhouse to die. Miss Marple listened to the chimes carefully. Then she said, almost to herself, "The poor man was afraid long before he was murdered." And suddenly, for the first time since the fete, she believed she understood why. The following day brought sunshine at last. Rose Hill emerged cautiously from beneath its cloud of rain and murder gossip alike. Gardens brightened, windows opened. The scent of cut grass drifted lazily through the lanes. Yet beneath the ordinary rhythm of village life uneasiness persisted. People lowered their voices when speaking of Greyfriars Hall. Children were warned away from the greenhouse, and every unfamiliar motor car inspired speculation. At 11 o'clock Miss Marple received a visitor. She was seated beside the drawing-room window sorting wool when Florence Keating, the postmistress's daughter, arrived breathless with excitement. "There's been another disturbance at the Hall." Miss Marple looked up mildly. How tiresome for them. Florence lowered herself eagerly into a chair. Inspector Hewitt was called again this morning. Indeed, and Miss Harcourt nearly fainted. Miss Marple selected another skein of wool. That is unusual. She does not strike me as a fainting type, which is why everyone noticed. Florence leaned forward dramatically. They found someone trying to enter the greenhouse last night. Miss Marple's hands became very still. Did they? One of the gardeners heard noises near the potting sheds after midnight, and saw someone? A woman. A woman wearing black gloves and a dark coat. She ran before he could stop her. Florence paused impressively. And the rear greenhouse door had been tampered with again. Miss Marple thanked her gently, and after several additional theories involving smuggling, espionage, and secret marriages, Florence departed satisfied. Miss Marple remained seated quietly for some time afterward. A woman in black gloves. The image lingered oddly in her mind, not because it was dramatic, but because it was practical. Black gloves concealed stains and fingerprints, yet she suspected something subtler still. Women wore gloves in villages for many reasons: elegance, vanity, age, insecurity. One learned a great deal from such choices. Miss Marple rose at last and fetched her hat. There were moments, she felt, when observation required movement. Greyfriars Hall appeared curiously diminished in daylight. The fair decorations had been removed, leaving only flattened grass and abandoned tent pegs upon the lawn. The great house itself seemed withdrawn into silence. Inspector Hewitt greeted Miss Marple in the library with the expression of a man uncertain whether assistance or interference had arrived. "You've heard. We found no intruder, but evidence of one. Possibly." He sounded unconvinced. Miss Marple seated herself calmly. "The gardener's description interests me. It interests the entire county. And you?" Hewitt rubbed his jaw tiredly. "I think panic spreads quickly after murders." "Yeah." "On the other hand," he added, "someone definitely attempted the greenhouse door again." "Recently?" "Very." The inspector crossed toward the desk and opened a folder. "The lock bears fresh scratches, and we found this." He held out a small object wrapped in cloth, a button, dark green. Miss Marple examined it carefully. "From a coat?" "Likely. Not a gardening coat." "No." She turned the button over thoughtfully. "Good quality. Expensive even. Not village-made." Inspector Hewitt watched her closely. "You recognize it?" "No," said Miss Marple honestly. "But women often recognize clothing details more readily than men." "That sounds ominous." "It is merely practical." The inspector sat opposite her. "You've formed theories." "Fragments only." "Share them." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "My dear Inspector, theories are like knitting patterns. One mustn't begin too confidently or the whole thing unravels." Before he could respond, the library door opened abruptly. Vivian Harcourt entered. She wore a pale grey dress today, severe in line yet striking against her dark hair. But her composure seemed thinner than before, as though exhaustion had worn through some inner reserve. She halted upon seeing Miss Marple. Inspector Hewitt rose. "We were discussing last night's incident." "I assumed as much," said Vivian coolly. Her gaze drifted briefly toward the button in Miss Marple's hand. Very briefly, but enough. Miss Marple noticed the reaction instantly. Not surprise. Vivian crossed toward the drinks cabinet. "You cannot seriously believe someone is haunting the greenhouse." "No," said Hewitt flatly. "Because Rosehill already behaves as though we're inside a penny dreadful." She poured herself a small brandy. Miss Marple observed quietly. "People become imaginative when frightened." Vivian turned sharply. "You think I'm frightened?" "My dear," said Miss Marple gently, "I think everyone at Greyfriars is frightened." Silence followed. Then, unexpectedly, Vivian laughed softly. "You know," she said, "Arthur warned me about you." "Did he?" "He said you notice things." Miss Marple folded her hands. "People notice themselves, usually. I merely listen." Vivian regarded her for several seconds. Then she said quietly, "Suppose someone did know something terrible about the past. Suppose they believed exposure would ruin lives." Inspector Hewitt straightened instantly. "What sort of exposure?" But Vivian ignored him. Her eyes remained fixed upon Miss Marple. "What would people do to prevent it?" Miss Marple answered very softly. "Almost anything." Something flickered across Vivian's face, then grief perhaps, or guilt too swift to define. Before anyone could speak further, the butler entered. "Dr. Fielding to see you, Inspector." The young doctor appeared moments later carrying his hat in one hand. He looked surprised to find the others assembled. "I hope I'm not interrupting." "Not at all," said Hewitt. "What is it?" Fielding hesitated. "I thought you ought to know. Mrs. Bell remembers seeing Crewe with a woman shortly before the murder." Inspector Hewitt leaned forward. "What woman?" She couldn't identify her clearly. "Dark coat." Vivian Harcourt set down her glass rather too carefully. "When?" "About 10 minutes before the screaming began." "And where?" asked Miss Marple. "Near the yew walk behind the greenhouse." A strange stillness settled over the room. Inspector Hewitt turned immediately toward Vivian. "You were wearing dark clothing that afternoon. So were half the women present. You admit being near the greenhouse?" "I was near half the estate." Miss Marple intervened mildly. "Did Mrs. Bell mention anything else?" Fielding nodded slowly. "She said the woman and Crewe appeared to be arguing." "What about?" "She couldn't hear." Inspector Hewitt's expression hardened visibly. "This becomes increasingly inconvenient, Miss Harcourt." Vivian met his gaze coldly. "How fortunate for you." But Miss Marple was no longer watching either of them. Her attention had shifted entirely to Dr. Fielding, because when Vivian spoke the young doctor had looked away, not casually, painfully, as though hearing something he wished not to hear. And suddenly a possibility stirred faintly at the back of Miss Marple's mind. Not yet a conclusion, only a shape involving jealousy. Jealousy, Miss Marple reflected, was among the most destructive emotions in the world precisely because it disguised itself so well beneath dignity. That evening, as dusk settled softly over Rose Hill, Miss Marple took her usual walk past the churchyard. The air smelled of damp earth and roses. She passed slowly beside the graves, her thoughts turning carefully over the day's discoveries. The anonymous letters, the greenhouse door, Vivian's fear, Dr. Fielding's discomfort, and Lionel Crewe himself frightened before death, haunted by something connected to the past. Then suddenly Miss Marple stopped walking altogether. A simple memory had returned to her, not about murder, about gardening. Years ago in St. Mary Mead, old Mr. Pettigrew had cultivated orchids in a heated conservatory. One winter he lost half the collection because of a fault in the ventilation system. "The danger," he had told her mournfully, "isn't what enters a greenhouse. It's what remains trapped inside." Miss Marple stood very still. Then she turned slowly toward Greyfriars Hall, visible beyond the darkening trees. The greenhouse. Not merely a meeting place, not merely a murder scene, a hiding place. And somewhere within it, she now felt certain, something had remained hidden for a very long time indeed. On Thursday morning, Inspector Hewitt ordered the greenhouse searched from end to end. Officially, this was because of the attempted break-in. Unofficially, it was because Miss Marple had looked thoughtful in a manner the inspector increasingly distrusted. The search began shortly after 9. Gardeners moved pots and trays beneath police supervision while Sergeant Pike catalogued tools, seed boxes, and shelves with grim determination. The greenhouse, deprived of its usual serenity, appeared oddly vulnerable in daylight, like a stage examined after the audience had gone home. Miss Marple arrived at 10:30 carrying a basket of gooseberries. Inspector Hewitt eyed the basket suspiciously. "You've brought fruit." "Why?" "One must eat," said Miss Marple reasonably. The inspector decided not to pursue the matter. At the far end of the greenhouse, Arthur Wexley stood watching the search with mounting agitation. He had slept badly again. The strain showed plainly now in his pale face and abrupt movements. "They'll destroy the place," he muttered. "No one is destroying anything," Hewitt replied curtly. "You've already turned my home into a police station." "That occurred when someone was murdered here." Wexley flinched visibly. Miss Marple noticed. So did Inspector Hewitt. Fear again. Always fear. Not the fear of arrest precisely, but of discovery. The distinction mattered enormously. Near the potting benches, Sergeant Pike called out suddenly. Everyone turned. The sergeant knelt beside a narrow iron cabinet built into the brick wall beneath hanging ferns. The lock's damaged. Hewitt crossed quickly. "Open it!" Pike tugged at the warped handle. After a brief resistance, the cabinet door sprang loose with a metallic crack. Inside lay gardening ledgers, packets of twine, rusted shears, and a small leather dispatch box. Arthur Wexley went completely white. Inspector Hewitt noticed instantly. "You know this box?" "No." "Too fast, too sharp." Hewitt lifted it carefully. "I haven't one," Miss Marple said gently. "Perhaps Mr. Crewe did." Silence followed. The inspector glanced toward her, then handed the box to Pike. "Force it." The lock gave way within moments. Inside were papers, nothing more dramatic than papers. Yet Miss Marple felt the atmosphere in the greenhouse alter at once, because paper, she knew, ruined lives more effectively than bullets ever could. Inspector Hewitt removed several folded documents, bank records, and beneath them, a photograph, faded slightly at the edges. Hewitt stared, then slowly passed it to Miss Marple. The photograph showed Greyfriars Hall perhaps 20 years earlier. Several figures stood posed before the greenhouse, smiling stiffly at the camera. Miss Marple recognized Arthur Wexley immediately as a boy of perhaps 12. Beside him stood an older man she assumed to be his father, and near the edge of the picture, Lionel Crewe, much younger, much thinner, but unmistakable. Miss Marple looked closer. There was another figure partly obscured by shadow near the greenhouse entrance. A woman, her face blurred slightly, yet something about her posture seemed oddly familiar. Inspector Hewitt unfolded another document sharply. "Well," he said grimly, "now we begin." Arthur Wexley stepped forward suddenly. "I want to see that. You may later. It concerns my family. It concerns a murder investigation." Hewitt scanned the papers rapidly. Then his expression changed. Miss Marple watched him carefully, surprise, and something else, understanding. "What is it?" she asked quietly. The inspector looked up. "These are financial agreements between Crewe and Arthur Wexley's father." Arthur closed his eyes briefly. "Old debts," he muttered. "No," said Hewitt slowly. "Not debts." He held up one page. "Payments." A stillness settled over the greenhouse. "Payments for what?" asked Miss Marple. Inspector Hewitt's voice became very measured. For silence, no one moved. Outside, somewhere beyond the glass, a rook cried harshly across the grounds. Arthur Wexley sank heavily onto a bench. "It was an accident," he said. Inspector Hewitt turned sharply. "What was?" But Wexley did not answer immediately. His face had collapsed inward somehow, as though years of strain suddenly showed all at once. Miss Marple spoke very softly. "There was a death here before, wasn't there?" Arthur looked at her with exhausted despair. Inspector Hewitt stared. "What death?" Wexley swallowed. "When I was a boy, a maid fell from the greenhouse gallery." Miss Marple felt a faint tightening in her chest. "How dreadful!" "She died instantly." "And Crewe knew something," said Hewitt. Arthur nodded miserably. "He handled everything afterward." The inspector's eyes sharpened. "What exactly did he handle?" Wexley gave a broken laugh. "My father's reputation. The inquest. Witnesses." Miss Marple understood immediately. Villages changed little over decades. Respectability still demanded protection. "What really happened to the girl?" she asked gently. Arthur stared at the floor. "She was pregnant. She worked here at Greyfriars. My father—" There was talk. "Then one night she fell from the upper walkway inside the greenhouse." "Accident or suicide?" asked Hewitt bluntly. "We never knew." Miss Marple thought, "Number." But someone did. Inspector Hewitt shuffled through the remaining papers. "These payments continued for years." "Blackmail?" Arthur gave no answer, which was answer enough. Miss Marple looked again at the old photograph, the blurred woman near the greenhouse, a servant perhaps, or a witness, and suddenly the anonymous letters took on new meaning. The dead remember, not theatrical after all. Deeply personal. Inspector Hewitt spoke quietly now. "You believe Crewe resumed blackmailing you recently?" Arthur rubbed both hands over his face. "He wanted money, more than I could manage." "And Miss Harcourt knew?" Arthur hesitated. "Yeah." At that moment footsteps sounded rapidly outside. Vivian Harcourt entered the greenhouse breathless and pale. "What's happened?" Her gaze moved instantly from Arthur's face to the open dispatch box. Then she understood. Miss Marple saw the realization strike her like physical pain. "Oh, God," Vivian whispered. Inspector Hewitt stepped forward. "You knew about this history?" "Yes." "How long?" "Since Arthur told me." "And Crewe threatened exposure?" Vivian laughed bitterly. "Threatened? He practically lived upon it." Arthur rose abruptly. "Leave her out of this." "Why?" snapped Hewitt. "Because she argued with Crewe before he died?" Vivian froze. Miss Marple's eyes lifted sharply. "You admit the argument, then?" Slowly Vivian nodded. The inspector's voice hardened. "What about?" "He wanted Arthur ruined." "And?" "And I told him he was a parasite. It suited him." Inspector Hewitt took another step nearer. "Did you meet him deliberately that afternoon?" Vivian's composure wavered for the first time. Arthur stared at her. "You told me you were in the rose garden." I lied. The word dropped heavily into the warm greenhouse air. Nobody spoke. Then Miss Marple said quietly, "My dear, why?" Vivian looked suddenly exhausted. "Because I thought they'd accuse me." Inspector Hewitt answered grimly, "They still might." Outside the clouds had begun gathering. They still might. Outside the clouds had begun gathering again, dimming the light through the greenhouse roof. The orchids cast strange twisted shadows along the pathways, and Miss Marple, standing among them, felt the shape of the past drawing steadily nearer at last, because hidden things, she knew, never remained buried forever, especially not inside glass houses. The storm arrived shortly after dusk. Heavy clouds rolled across the Surrey hills, swallowing the last traces of evening light, and by 8 o'clock rain battered Rose Hill with renewed violence. Wind rattled windows and bent the trees along the lanes into restless shadows. At Greyfriars Hall the atmosphere inside matched the weather exactly. Dinner had been a strained and joyless affair. Arthur Wexley barely touched his food. Vivian Harcourt spoke only when necessary. Even the servants moved with unusual quietness, as though the house itself listened. Afterward, Arthur retired to the library with whiskey and silence. Vivian wandered restlessly from room to room, and, somewhere above them all, the storm beat steadily against the glass roof of the greenhouse. At 9:30 the telephone rang. The butler answered. A moment later he appeared at the library door looking distinctly uneasy. "There is a call for Miss Harcourt, sir." Vivian, seated near the fire, looked startled. "For me?" She crossed the room slowly and lifted the receiver in the hall. "Hello?" At first there was only static beneath the crackle of rain. Then a voice spoke, deliberately quiet. "You should not have opened the box." Vivian went cold. "Who is this?" "The dead remember." The line went dead immediately. For several seconds she remained motionless, gripping the receiver hard enough to whiten her knuckles. Arthur emerged from the library at once. "What is it?" Vivian replaced the receiver carefully. "Nothing." But her face betrayed her completely. Arthur crossed toward her. "Vivian." After a moment she said quietly, "Someone telephoned." "I don't know." "What did they say?" She hesitated, then repeated the words. Arthur stared at her in horror. "No. It's someone trying to frighten us. They've succeeded." At that exact moment a tremendous gust of wind slammed rain against the hall windows with explosive force. Vivian flinched visibly. Arthur took her arm gently. "You're shaking." "I'm tired." Neither noticed the maid passing silently through the corridor carrying fresh towels, nor that she paused very briefly upon hearing the conversation. Miss Marple heard about the telephone call the following morning. Information travelled remarkably efficiently through servants. She sat in the vicarage garden shelling peas, while the vicar's wife relayed details in tones of fascinated horror. A man's voice, apparently, though cook says it sounded disguised. "How theatrical," murmured Miss Marple. "That's exactly what Inspector Hewitt said." "Did he indeed?" The vicar's wife leaned closer. "And there's more. There usually is. She says Miss Harcourt wanted to leave the hall immediately, but didn't?" "No." Mr. Wexley persuaded her to stay. Miss Marple continued shelling peas thoughtfully. People behaved curiously under fear. Some fled. Others clung stubbornly to danger because departure itself felt like surrender. "Has the inspector discovered anything new?" she asked. The vicar's wife lowered her voice instinctively. "They say the dead maid's name was Alice Dorr." Miss Marple's hands paused. "Alice Dorr?" "Yeah." "Do you remember her?" "Vaguely." And suddenly she did. A fair-haired girl with quick laughter. Too pretty perhaps for safety in certain households. Miss Marple remembered another thing too. Alice Dorr had possessed a younger sister, a child at the time. Her fingers became very still among the peas. "How long ago did Alice die?" she asked quietly. "Oh, nearly 20 years." The storm clouds drifted slowly above the garden walls. 20 years. Long enough for children to become adults. Long enough for grief to ripen into hatred. Miss Marple said nothing further aloud, but a possibility had begun taking shape inside her mind with uncomfortable clarity. Inspector Hewitt arrived at noon carrying irritation and damp newspapers. "You were correct again." Miss Marple looked apologetic. "One dislikes overdoing it. The maid Alice Dorr did have a younger sister." "Yes?" "Clara Dorr, or rather Clara Vane now." Miss Marple's knitting slipped slightly in her lap. "Vane. You recognize it?" "Not exactly, but she was thinking rapidly." Inspector Hewitt continued pacing. "She vanished from the district years ago. We're attempting to locate her. Do you possess a photograph? Unfortunately, no. Miss Marple considered. A younger sister watching her family ruined by scandal and death. You think she returned for revenge? I think it possible. Hewitt stopped pacing. There's another matter. Yes? The anonymous letters were typed on an old Underwood machine. Common enough, except we found a matching ribbon at Greyfriars. Miss Marple looked up sharply. Where? In the old estate office. Used recently? The inspector sat down heavily. It's all becoming too neat, too convenient. Miss Marple smiled faintly. My dear Inspector, convenient evidence generally belongs to inconvenient truths. Before he could respond, the cottage doorbell rang. Florence Keating entered breathlessly once again. Ah! I hope I'm not interrupting. You already are, said Hewitt. Florence ignored this. There's been another incident. The inspector closed his eyes briefly. Where? At the greenhouse. They arrived at Greyfriars within 15 minutes. Rainwater still glistened across the pathways from the previous night's storm. Gardeners and servants clustered nervously near the greenhouse entrance while Sergeant Pike attempted unsuccessfully to disperse them. What happened? Demanded Hewitt. Pike pointed silently inside. Miss Marple followed the others along the central path. The greenhouse felt colder today. Not physically perhaps, but emotionally stripped somehow, as though its secrets had begun surfacing too quickly. Near the rear potting benches stood Dr. Julian Fielding, and beside him, pale and furious, was Vivian Harcourt. At their feet lay a smashed flower-pot. Miss Marple's gaze shifted beyond it, to the wall. Someone had written there in chalk, Alice knows. No one spoke for several seconds. Then Hewitt exploded. Damn this nonsense, Dr. Fielding said quietly. It was discovered an hour ago. By whom? One of the gardeners. Vivian folded her arms tightly. This is becoming madness. Miss Marple looked carefully at the words, not hurried, not trembling. Firm, deliberate strokes. Inspector Hewitt turned sharply toward Vivian. Did you come here this morning? Yes. Alone. Why? To think. The inspector's expression remained grim. You understand how this appears? Vivian laughed suddenly harshly this time. Oh, everything appears dreadful now, Inspector. Miss Marple, meanwhile, was studying Dr. Fielding. The young doctor seemed deeply uneasy, not merely disturbed, burdened, as though each new revelation pressed upon something already troubling him. Then Miss Marple noticed something else. Mud. Fresh mud upon the doctor's shoes, not unusual in itself, except the greenhouse pathways were dry. Her eyes moved slowly toward the rear entrance near the potting sheds. Very interesting indeed. That evening Miss Marple sat alone beside her fire long after dark. Rain had ceased at last. The village lay quiet beneath drifting mist. Upon the table beside her rested several facts arranged carefully in her thoughts like pieces upon a chessboard. Alice Dorr, the younger sister, the Lavis, the hidden payments, Vivian's fear, and Dr. Fielding's increasingly strained behavior. But one thing troubled her more than all the others, the messages. The dead remember. Alice knows, not written by someone merely threatening exposure. Number. They possessed emotion, personal emotion. And personal emotion, Miss Marple reflected, was extraordinarily difficult to imitate convincingly. She leaned back slowly in her chair, then suddenly sat upright again. A memory had surfaced, not about murder this time, about handwriting. Years earlier in St. Mary Mead, a young woman had forged threatening letters to herself in order to conceal an entirely different crime. The mistake that exposed her had been simple. The emotional tone was wrong. Real hatred aged, false hatred performed. Miss Marple stared thoughtfully into the fire, and for the first time since Lionel Crewe died beneath the orchids, she began to suspect that the person creating fear in the greenhouse might not be the murderer at all. Miss Marple believed firmly that conversations were rather like fishing. One did not splash about noisily frightening everything away. One sat quietly, appeared harmless, and waited. By Friday morning, Rosehill had become exhausted by excitement. This was fortunate. People who grow accustomed to scandal begin speaking more naturally about it. The village moved beneath low, drifting clouds and occasional weak sunshine. Deliveries resumed. Gardens required tending. Chickens escaped from their proper places. Life, with stubborn English determination, insisted upon continuing. Miss Marple spent the morning calling upon acquaintances. Officially, she was delivering jars of blackberry preserve. Unofficially, she was listening. At 10:30, she visited Mrs. Bell. The former parlour-maid received her eagerly. "Well," declared Mrs. Bell before Miss Marple had fully entered, "there'll be another murder before long. I said so yesterday." "One hopes not," murmured Miss Marple. "Mrs." Bell lowered herself dramatically into a chair. "That writing on the greenhouse wall dreadful. And poor Alice Dorr dragged into everything after all these years." Miss Marple accepted tea quietly. "You knew Alice well?" "Oh, yes, sweet girl." "Happy?" Mrs. Bell hesitated. "No." "She changed after Mr. Wexley's father took an interest in her." "Did people know?" "In villages people always know." Miss Marple nodded gently, and yet villagers also pretended not to know when reputation required silence. "What about her sister?" she asked. "Little Clara?" "Yes." Mrs. Bell frowned thoughtfully. "Quiet child, very attached to Alice. Did she remain here after her sister died?" "Went away to relatives eventually." "Was she bitter?" Mrs. Bell gave a short, uncomfortable laugh. "My dear Miss Marple, children who lose everything usually are." That, thought Miss Marple, was true enough. But bitterness alone did not explain everything. Not the staging, not the theatricality, not the carefully planted fear. As she departed, Mrs. Bell added suddenly, "There's something odd, though." Miss Marple paused. "Yes?" "Clara used to hide in the greenhouse constantly as a girl." Miss Marple became very still. "In the greenhouse?" "She loved it there. Alice would bring her sometimes when Mrs. Wexley wasn't about." "Yes. Funny thing is, Clara always said the greenhouse remembered people." Miss Marple turned slowly. "What an unusual expression." Mrs. Bell shrugged. "Children say peculiar things." "Yes," thought Miss Marple. "But sometimes they remembered peculiar things, too." That afternoon Inspector Hewitt called again. He looked tired, damp, and increasingly irritable. "We still can't locate Clara Vane. Perhaps she does not wish to be located. That possibility had occurred to me." Miss Marple poured tea. "Any progress otherwise?" The inspector sat heavily. "Dr. Fielding. You suspected him." "I suspected everyone at various points. That's not helpful." "No," agreed Miss Marple. "But it is generally accurate." Hewitt accepted tea impatiently. "We questioned him again regarding the morning the chalk message appeared." "And?" "He admits entering through the rear greenhouse path before anyone else arrived." Miss Marple stirred her tea slowly. "But not writing the message. Why did he go there?" The inspector hesitated. "He says he was concerned about Vivian Harcourt." "Concerned in what way?" "He claims she sounded frightened during a conversation the previous evening." Miss Marple looked thoughtfully into her teacup. "And is he in love with her?" Hewitt nearly choked. "Good God!" "My dear Inspector, one cannot investigate murder while ignoring love. It would be like gardening without considering weather." The inspector rubbed his forehead. "He denies any improper attachment." "Of course." "But you believe otherwise." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Men who are secretly unhappy tend to look away when certain women speak." Hewitt stared. "You notice that?" "My dear man, elderly ladies notice everything. People simply forget we are present." The inspector muttered something inaudible that sounded remarkably like agreement. "There's another development," he said after a moment. "We discovered Lionel Crewe withdrew a substantial amount of money 3 days before his death. Nearly £2,000. Miss Marple looked up sharply now. "That is considerable. But no money was found on the body?" "None." "Interesting indeed. Blackmail payments, perhaps, or preparations. What did Crewe intend to do with it?" "We don't know." Miss Marple folded her hands quietly. "Money complicated motives wonderfully. Revenge killed occasionally. Fear killed often. But money killed constantly." Later that evening Miss Marple attended the church sewing circle. Murder investigations, she had long ago discovered, benefited enormously from respectable routine. The women gathered in the parish hall beneath weak electric lights, discussing hems, ration memories, and scandal with equal seriousness. Miss Marple listened gently while stitching cuffs. Presently Mrs. Finch leaned nearer. "I saw Miss Harcourt in tears yesterday." "Did you?" "Near the yew walk." Miss Marple's needle paused almost invisibly. "Alone?" "No, Dr. Fielding was with her." "Comforting her?"
"Well—"
Finch lowered her voice dramatically. It looked rather intimate. Across the room another woman added, "They've grown very close lately." Miss Marple made no immediate reply, but inwardly several pieces shifted position. Dr. Fielding, Vivian, Arthur Wexley, and Lionel Crewe frightening them all before his death. At that moment the church hall door opened. Vivian Harcourt herself entered. Conversation altered instantly. Not silence exactly, but carefulness. Vivian seemed aware of it and tired of it simultaneously. She crossed toward Miss Marple directly. "May I speak with you?" "Certainly, my dear." They moved together toward the quieter vestibule near the coat stands. For a moment Vivian said nothing. "You think badly of me?" Miss Marple looked surprised. "No. Everyone else does. My dear, villagers think badly of anyone interesting. It keeps them entertained." Unexpectedly, Vivian smiled faintly. Then the smile vanished. "I'm frightened." The honesty of it hung quietly between them. "Yes," said Miss Marple gently. "I know." Vivian clasped her gloves tightly. "I didn't kill Lionel Crewe."
"No."
The younger woman stared. "You sound certain." "I believe you capable of anger," said Miss Marple softly. "Not coldness." Something in Vivian's face shifted, then relief perhaps, or gratitude. "You're kinder than I expected." "No," said Miss Marple. "Only observant." Vivian hesitated. Crewe was blackmailing Arthur. But not only about Alice Dorr. Miss Marple's eyes sharpened. "What else?" "He discovered something recently."
"What?"
"I don't know exactly. Arthur wouldn't tell me. But it frightened him." "Yes." Vivian lowered her voice further. "The day before the murder I overheard them arguing in the library," Crewe said. "If the truth comes out, you'll lose everything." Miss Marple sat very still. "Did Arthur answer?" "What did he say?" Vivian swallowed. "He said, 'You should have left the greenhouse buried.'" Silence followed, a silence full of meaning not yet understood. At last Miss Marple asked quietly, "What did you think he meant?" Vivian shook her head helplessly. "I still don't know." But Miss Marple, walking home later beneath the drifting mist and dim village lamps, began to suspect she did. Not fully, not yet, but enough to feel the first cold edge of certainty. Because the greenhouse, she thought, had not merely witnessed death. It had preserved something. Had not merely witnessed death. It had preserved something. Something hidden. Something Lionel Crewe had discovered too late. And somewhere very nearby someone was still desperately trying to keep it buried. Saturday morning arrived bright and unnaturally clear after days of rain. The village seemed washed pale beneath the sunlight, every hedge and rooftop sharply defined. Yet the brightness brought no comfort to Greyfriars Hall. Inspector Hewitt had returned early with 2 constables and a warrant. At 9:30 Miss Marple received a brief note delivered by Sergeant Pike himself. "Inspector Hewitt requests your presence at Greyfriars immediately." That alone was sufficiently unusual. By 10 o'clock she stood once more inside the greenhouse. But today the atmosphere was entirely different. The orchids had been moved aside. The central stone pathway stood partially dismantled, and near the rear wall, beneath the old iron staging shelves, workmen knelt removing wooden floor panels under Hewitt's direction. Arthur Wexley looked as though he had aged 10 years overnight. Vivian Harcourt remained silent beside him, pale but composed. Dr. Fielding stood near the entrance, visibly tense. Miss Marple approached the inspector quietly. "You have found something." "Yes." His voice was grim. One of the gardeners remembered an old storage pit beneath the greenhouse floor. "We examined the estate plans this morning. There's a concealed drainage chamber beneath the rear section." Miss Marple looked toward the lifted boards, and suddenly understood the true meaning of Arthur's words. "You should have left the greenhouse buried." Not metaphorical, literal. Inspector Hewitt spoke sharply to the workmen. "Careful now." A final panel lifted free. Beneath it lay darkness. Cool, damp air rose slowly upward, carrying the smell of earth long sealed away. One constable lowered a lantern carefully into the opening, then froze. Hewitt stepped forward immediately. Miss Marple did not move closer. She already knew. Not exactly what, but enough. Several long seconds passed before the inspector spoke again. "There are bones." Silence flooded the greenhouse. Vivian covered her mouth. Arthur Wexley closed his eyes completely. Dr. Fielding stared downward with unmistakable horror. Inspector Hewitt turned slowly toward Arthur. "You'd better explain this now." Arthur gave a strange, exhausted laugh. "I can't." "You'd better try." Miss Marple watched him carefully. There are moments, she reflected, when human beings stop struggling simply because the truth has become heavier than concealment. Arthur sank onto a bench. "My father found her there." The words emerged barely above a whisper. "After she fell." Inspector Hewitt's face hardened. "And instead of reporting properly, he hid the body beneath the greenhouse?" "No!" Arthur looked up desperately. "No, not Alice." A silence followed. Then Miss Marple said quietly, "There was someone else." Arthur nodded slowly. Inspector Hewitt stared. Good God! Arthur rubbed trembling hands across his face. My father argued with a man that night, a laborer named Thomas Briggs. Miss Marple listened carefully. He'd discovered the affair with Alice, Arthur continued. Threatened scandal, threatened exposure. And they fought inside the greenhouse during the storm. The sunlight filtering through the glass suddenly seemed cold. What happened to Briggs? Asked Hewitt. Arthur swallowed. He fell, Miss Marple said softly. From the upper walkway? Arthur nodded again. My father panicked. Crew helped him? Inspector Hewitt's voice became dangerously quiet. They concealed the body, and blamed Alice's death upon suicide afterward. Arthur looked physically ill now. She truly did die accidentally later that same night. She came looking for Briggs. She slipped on the wet gallery steps. No one spoke. The sheer ugliness of it settled heavily through the greenhouse air. 2 deaths, one hidden deliberately, the other buried beneath lies. Miss Marple closed her eyes briefly. Human wickedness so often began with cowardice. Inspector Hewitt turned sharply. And Crew blackmailed your father afterward. Yes. Then later blackmailed you? Arthur gave a bitter nod. He said the truth would destroy the family forever. Dr. Fielding spoke suddenly for the first time. My God. Everyone turned. The young doctor looked shaken beyond composure now. Vivian moved instinctively toward him, and Miss Marple noticed something important immediately. Arthur noticed too, only for an instant, but enough. A tiny flash of hurt. Very interesting indeed. Inspector Hewitt folded his arms. This explains the letters. No, said Miss Marple quietly. Everyone looked at her. She stepped slowly toward the open chamber beneath the floor. The letters reference Alice repeatedly, not Thomas Briggs. Hewitt frowned. So whoever wrote them cared specifically about Alice Dorr. The inspector stared. Then understanding dawned. Possibly. Arthur looked up sharply. Clara? Miss Marple turned toward him. You knew her? She came to the hall once years later, after my father died. Why? To ask questions. What sort of questions? About Alice, about the greenhouse. And your father? He refused to see her. Inspector Hewitt began pacing again. So Clara discovers the truth somehow. Returns years later seeking revenge. Frightens Crew. Murders him. It is plausible, admitted Miss Marple. But, she looked quietly around the greenhouse. But something still troubles me. What? Hewitt blinked. The staging? Miss Marple pointed gently upward toward the iron gallery overhead. Alice Dorr supposedly slipped from there, and Thomas Briggs fell during a struggle. But both accidents occurred during heavy rain. The inspector frowned impatiently. Yes? Miss Marple's voice remained soft. The iron walkway would have become extremely slippery. Obviously. Yes. She folded her hands. Yet there are no railings missing, no damaged sections, nothing structurally dangerous at all. Inspector Hewitt stared. So, my dear Inspector, people fall accidentally from heights far less often than murderers claim. Silence followed. Vivian whispered. You think Alice was pushed? Miss Marple did not answer immediately, because another thought had just arrived. Quiet. Terrible. She turned slowly toward Dr. Fielding. The young doctor stood utterly motionless near the entrance, pale beneath the sunlight. And suddenly Miss Marple realized something extraordinary. He was not shocked by the hidden skeleton. He was shocked by the mention of Alice Dorr herself, as though her name mattered personally, deeply personally. Miss Marple spoke very carefully now. Dr. Fielding, how long have you lived in Rosehill? He looked startled. Only 8 months. And before that? London. She tilted her head gently. What was your mother's maiden name? The silence that followed seemed to stop the very air inside the greenhouse. Fielding's face changed completely. Not guilt, not anger. Real fear. Miss Marple, said Inspector Hewitt sharply, what are you implying? But Miss Marple was still watching the doctor, and in that moment, before he spoke a single word, she knew with absolute certainty. The past had not merely returned to Rosehill. It had been living quietly among them all along. No one moved inside the greenhouse. Sunlight burned pale upon the glass roof overhead, while dust drifted slowly through the warm, still air. Beneath the lifted floorboards, the hidden chamber remained open like a wound from another century, and at the edge of the silence stood Dr. Julian Fielding. Miss Marple watched him steadily. People confronted suddenly by truth, she reflected, rarely collapse dramatically as novels suggest. More often they simply become very tired. Fielding looked tired now, utterly tired. Inspector Hewitt took a step forward. "Well?" The doctor removed his spectacles slowly. "My mother's name," he said at last, "was Clara." Arthur Wexley stared. Vivian drew a sharp breath. Miss Marple remained very still. "Clara Dorr?" asked Hewitt. The inspector's voice hardened immediately. "And you neglected to mention this earlier?" Fielding gave a faint, bitter smile. "You never asked." "That is not amusing." "No," said the doctor quietly. "It isn't." Miss Marple spoke gently. "You are Alice Dorr's nephew." Outside, somewhere beyond the greenhouse walls, a gardener shouted faintly across the grounds. The ordinary sound seemed strangely distant. Inspector Hewitt folded his arms. "Start explaining." Fielding looked down briefly toward the open chamber beneath the floor. "My mother never recovered from Alice's death," he said. "Not really. Miss Marple could imagine it easily enough. A young girl losing her sister under scandalous circumstances, while powerful people buried truth behind money and reputation. Villages could be very cruel to the powerless." "She believed Alice had been murdered?" asked Miss Marple. "Yes." "And was she correct?" Fielding's face tightened. "She thought the Wexley family destroyed everything afterward to protect themselves." Arthur said hoarsely, "We were children." "My father wasn't," replied Fielding sharply. The sudden anger in his voice startled everyone, and Miss Marple thought, "There it is at last. Not theatrical hatred. Old hatred, aged properly over years." Inspector Hewitt interrupted. "You came to Rose Hill deliberately, then?" "To investigate?" Fielding hesitated. "At first, only to see the place." "The greenhouse?" Miss Marple said softly. "Your mother spoke about it often." The doctor looked at her almost with surprise. "All the time," he admitted. "She said the greenhouse remembered what people tried to bury." Miss Marple nodded gently. Exactly the sort of phrase grief-stricken people repeated until children absorbed it like prayer. Inspector Hewitt remained unimpressed. "You wrote the anonymous letters?" Fielding looked up sharply. "No." "You expect me to believe that?" "It's the truth. The references to Alice, the greenhouse, the past." "Yes," said Fielding tiredly. "I understand how it appears. And the chalk message?" "I didn't write that either." Inspector Hewitt's expression darkened. "But you did enter through the rear path that morning." "Why?" Fielding glanced briefly toward Vivian Harcourt. Too briefly, perhaps, for most observers. Not for Miss Marple. "Because Miss Harcourt asked me to meet her." Vivian stared at him. "Juliane." Inspector Hewitt wheeled instantly toward her. "You neglected to mention this." Vivian's composure cracked. "I didn't think it mattered." "Everything matters." Miss Marple intervened softly. "Why did you ask Dr. Fielding to meet you?" Vivian pressed one hand against the back of a chair. "Because I was frightened." "Of whom?" "The letters. Everything." Her voice shook now despite her efforts. "I thought someone was trying to drive Arthur mad." Inspector Hewitt narrowed his eyes. "And Dr. Fielding?" "He'd been kind to me." Again Miss Marple noticed Arthur's expression. Quiet but unmistakable. "Interesting indeed." Fielding said quietly. "She wanted advice." "Medical advice?" asked Hewitt dryly. "No." The doctor's face colored faintly. Vivian closed her eyes briefly. Miss Marple thought, "Now we approach the true emotional arrangements." Inspector Hewitt, however, remained focused elsewhere. "Where were you at 4 o'clock on the day of the murder?" "In my surgery until shortly after the screaming began." "Can anyone confirm that?" "My receptionist." Hewitt grunted. "And your mother? Where is she now?" Fielding hesitated. The answer altered the room somehow. Not dramatically, but enough. Miss Marple spoke gently. "When did she die?" "Last winter." "I am sorry." Fielding looked suddenly older. She never stopped thinking about Alice, even after 20 years. Miss Marple believed him completely. Some griefs calcified into identity. Inspector Hewitt remained skeptical. "When exactly did you learn the truth about Thomas Briggs?" Fielding looked surprised. "The hidden body. I didn't know until today. You expect me to believe that too?" Miss Marple listened carefully. No evasion. No theatrical denial, simply exhaustion, and she thought, number, he did not know, at least not consciously, yet something still troubled her deeply, because Julian, Fielding fit only part of the pattern, the emotional part, not the practical one. Inspector Hewitt said abruptly, "You had motive enough to kill Crewe." Fielding met his gaze steadily. "Did you?" "No." "Can you prove it?" "No." The inspector turned away impatiently. Arthur Wexley suddenly spoke. "He's telling the truth." Everyone looked at him. Vivian stared in astonishment. Arthur swallowed heavily. Crewe frightened Julian too. Why would he? Snapped Hewitt. Arthur looked toward the open chamber beneath the floorboards. Because Crewe enjoyed frightening everyone, Miss Marple said thoughtfully. Yes, I think he did. That type existed everywhere. People who fed quietly upon power over others, not dramatic villains. Respectable ones. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple walked slowly through the rose gardens behind Greyfriars with Vivian Harcourt beside her. The younger woman seemed exhausted beyond concealment now. You believe Julian innocent, Vivian said quietly. Why? Miss Marple adjusted her gloves. Because he possesses genuine anger. Vivian blinked. That sounds absurd. Not really. Murderers who plan carefully over time generally nurture... Not really. Murderers who plan carefully over time generally nurture colder emotions than anger. Vivian looked away. And what about me? Miss Marple smiled faintly. My dear, you are far too transparent emotionally. That's hardly flattering. It is extremely reassuring. They walked a few steps farther in silence. Then Vivian stopped suddenly. There's something I haven't told anyone. Miss Marple waited. The day before the murder, Lionel Crewe threatened Arthur directly. How? He said someone else knew the truth about the greenhouse. Miss Marple's attention sharpened instantly. Someone besides Dr. Fielding? Did he name them? No. Vivian lowered her voice. But he said something strange. What? He said. She remembers more than you think. Miss Marple stopped walking. A woman, then. Not Julian Fielding. Not Arthur. A woman tied somehow to the past. Miss Marple thought rapidly. Alice Dorr was dead. Clara Dorr was dead. Number. Not impossible, but unlikely. And then another possibility came quietly into her mind. So quiet she almost missed it. A woman who remembered. A woman still near Greyfriars. Someone villagers overlooked because they always overlook certain kinds of women. Miss Marple looked slowly back toward the hall, toward the servants' wing partly visible beyond the hedges. And suddenly she said, Tell me, my dear, how long has the maid Elsie worked here? Vivian Harcourt stared. Elsie? The housemaid? Miss Marple nodded gently. Vivian frowned in confusion. She's been at Greyfriars perhaps a year. Why? Miss Marple did not answer immediately, because the thought forming in her mind remained incomplete, one of those delicate intuitions that arrived before evidence did. Instead she said mildly, How old is she? 22 perhaps. Quiet girl. Very efficient. And local? I believe she came from Kent. Very interesting indeed. Miss Marple resumed walking slowly along the rose path. Sometimes, she reflected, truth arrived sideways, not through dramatic revelations, but through tiny domestic inconsistencies people considered too ordinary to notice. A servant, a frightened solicitor, a greenhouse full of buried memory, and somewhere among them a woman who remembered more than she should. That evening Inspector Hewitt returned to Greyfriars determined, as he informed Sergeant Pike, to stop chasing ghosts and arrest someone practical. Unfortunately, the case resisted practicality. He questioned Elsie Turner in the morning room shortly after 7. She entered nervously, twisting her apron between pale fingers. A fair girl, plain rather than pretty. The sort of person whose face disappeared instantly in crowds, which, Miss Marple knew, often made such women invisible in dangerous ways. Inspector Hewitt gestured toward a chair. How long have you worked here, Miss Turner? 14 months, sir. You knew Lionel Crewe? A little. Did you like him? Elsie hesitated. No, sir. Why not? He made people uncomfortable. The answer surprised Hewitt slightly because it sounded intelligent rather than rehearsed. How so? He watched people. Interesting, thought the inspector reluctantly. That matched other descriptions precisely. Did he ever threaten you? No, sir. But you feared him. A flicker crossed her face. Sometimes. Why? Elsie looked down. I don't know. Hewitt studied her carefully. Fear again. Everyone in this house seemed frightened of Lionel Crewe. Yet fear took different shapes. Arthur feared exposure. Vivian feared destruction. Julian Fielding feared inherited truth. But Elsie, her fear felt personal somehow. You were here the night of the anonymous telephone call? You overheard part of the conversation. The girl startled visibly. How did you know? Because servants always overhear things. A faint, unwilling smile touched her face. Yes, sir. What exactly did you hear? Only the words about the box being opened. And Miss Harcourt sounded frightened afterward. Inspector Hewitt leaned back slightly. Did you ever enter the greenhouse yourself? A pause. How often? Sometimes to fetch flowers. At night? No, sir. Too quick. Hewitt noticed immediately. So never after dark? Elsie twisted her apron harder. No. The inspector's eyes narrowed. Miss Turner. Before he could continue, the morning-room door opened unexpectedly. Miss Marple entered carrying a basket covered neatly with cloth. "Oh, dear," she said mildly. "Am I interrupting?" Inspector Hewitt nearly groaned aloud. "You usually are." "I brought seed cake for the staff." Elsie rose immediately. "I'll take it to cook." "No hurry, my dear," said Miss Marple pleasantly. But the girl had already left rather too quickly. Inspector Hewitt folded his arms. "You did that deliberately." "She was about to tell me something." "No," said Miss Marple softly. "She was about to panic." The inspector exhaled impatiently. "You suspect her." "I suspect everyone." "That answer again." "It remains accurate." Miss Marple seated herself calmly. "My dear Inspector, frightened girls often conceal things for reasons entirely unrelated to murder. You think she's hiding something else." "What?" Miss Marple folded her hands. "I am not yet sure." The inspector paced toward the window. "Fielding has motive. Arthur Wexley has motive. Vivian Harcourt lied repeatedly. Now perhaps the maid is involved somehow. The whole house seems infected with secrets." "Yes," said Miss Marple thoughtfully. "Secrets spread rather like mildew in old buildings." Hewitt turned sharply. "What bothers me most is timing." "How so?" "The anonymous letters began only weeks ago." "Yeah." "But the original deaths occurred 20 years earlier." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Very good." The inspector frowned. "You already noticed." "Of course." "Then why begin now?" "Ah," said Miss Marple softly, "that is precisely the correct question. Because revenge delayed for decades was unusual. Something had changed recently, something that reawakened the past, and Lionel Crewe somehow had known it first. Later that night, Miss Marple sat awake beside her fire reviewing every conversation carefully. Outside, mist drifted silently through Rosehill lanes. The village slept uneasily. She thought again about Elsie Turner. Invisible girls, quiet girls, girls who listened while others ignored them. And suddenly a small memory returned. During the fete itself, just before the screaming began, Miss Marple had briefly seen someone carrying flowers from the greenhouse toward the house. Not a guest, a servant, a fair-haired servant. Miss Marple sat upright slowly. The flowers, not roses, white orchids. Her eyes narrowed thoughtfully. Orchids from the rear benches, near the hidden floor chamber. Interesting indeed. Very few servants selected exotic flowers casually during village fetes. Too expensive, too noticeable, unless they possessed familiarity with them already, or emotional attachment. Miss Marple rose and crossed toward the window. Beyond the dark village rooftops lay Greyfriars Hall invisible among trees. And suddenly another memory surfaced beside the first. Mrs. Bell saying Clara Dore had hidden in the greenhouse constantly as a child. Children learn spaces intimately. Hidden corners, storage chambers, loose boards beneath floors. Miss Marple became very still. Then she spoke aloud softly to the empty room. "No!" Because another possibility had appeared. Not that Elsie Turner was Clara Dore. The ages failed entirely. But perhaps she belonged to someone else who remembered. Someone connected not merely to Alice, but to Thomas Briggs as well. Miss Marple's eyes widened faintly. Thomas Briggs, the hidden skeleton beneath the greenhouse. A laborer no one had discussed much because servants' tragedies rarely interested respectable villages long. But Thomas Briggs might easily have had family too, children perhaps, and children inherited anger very efficiently indeed. The thought disturbed her profoundly, because it altered the shape of the case completely. This was no longer merely buried scandal. It was inheritance. Inheritance of grief. Inheritance of silence. Inheritance of hatred. Miss Marple looked toward the clock. Nearly midnight. And at that exact moment the telephone rang. The sudden sound shattered the cottage silence violently. Miss Marple crossed quickly and lifted the receiver. "Hello?" For a second there was only breathing. Then a frightened whisper. "Please, you must come." "Who is this?" "It's Elsie." The girl must come. "Who is this?" "It's Elsie." The girl sounded terrified. "He knows?" Miss Marple's voice sharpened instantly. "Who knows?" But before Elsie could answer, another sound came faintly through the line. A door opening. Footsteps. Then a sharp cry. And the connection went dead. Miss Marple did not telephone Inspector Hewitt immediately. Instead, she put on her coat. There are moments, she believed, when instinct must move faster than procedure. Within 15 minutes, she was seated beside Inspector Hewitt in the police motorcar speeding through the dark lanes toward Greyfriars Hall, while rain began once more against the windscreen. "You should have called sooner," he muttered. "My dear Inspector, I called within 3 minutes." "Yes, but why go yourself first?" "Because frightened girls do not telephone elderly ladies at midnight unless they trust them particularly." The inspector grunted. This, irritatingly, sounded reasonable. The hall emerged from the darkness ahead, several windows blazing with light. Something had happened already. They knew it at once. Before the motor car even stopped, the front door burst open and Sergeant Pike appeared white-faced beneath the lamps. "What is it?" "It's Miss Turner." A terrible stillness followed. Miss Marple closed her eyes briefly. Too late. Elsie Turner lay in the small morning room near the servants' corridor. Dr. Fielding knelt beside her when they entered, his face grim and exhausted. But one glance was enough. Miss Marple had seen death before, too often. The girl lay crumpled near the writing desk, one hand still outstretched toward the fallen telephone receiver. There was a dark bruise around her throat. Inspector Hewitt swore softly under his breath. Fielding rose slowly. "She's gone." Vivian Harcourt stood near the doorway, pale with shock. Arthur Wexley looked physically ill. Miss Marple's eyes moved quietly about the room. The overturned chair, the broken porcelain vase near the hearth, and something else. Mud again. Fresh mud upon the carpet beneath the window. Inspector Hewitt turned sharply. "Who found her?" "The butler," said Vivian faintly. "He heard something fall." "What time?" "Perhaps 12:15. "And where was everyone else?" "In our rooms." Hewitt's expression darkened. "Convenient." Arthur exploded suddenly. "Oh, for God's sake!" The violence of it startled them all. "You think everyone here is a murderer?" Inspector Hewitt answered coldly. "One of you certainly is." Miss Marple, meanwhile, had crossed quietly toward the desk. There, half-trapped beneath the fallen telephone cord, lay a folded scrap of paper. She picked it up gently. Inspector Hewitt noticed instantly. "What's that?" Miss Marple unfolded it carefully. Only 3 words were written. They lied too. Silence spread through the room. Hewitt took the note sharply. "Her handwriting?" Fielding glanced at it. "I think so," Miss Marple said softly. "She intended to tell someone something." The inspector looked furious now. "And someone stopped her." Outside thunder rolled distantly across the hills. The house seemed to shiver beneath it. 2 hours later the hall remained awake beneath police lamps and exhausted fear. Servants whispered together in corridors. Doors opened and shut softly. And throughout it all the greenhouse loomed dark beyond the rain-streaked windows like some silent witness refusing to speak plainly. Miss Marple sat alone for a time in the library. She was thinking not about Elsie's death itself, but about timing. Murders committed from panic possessed a different texture from planned crimes. Elsie had telephoned because she discovered something, or remembered something, and whoever killed her had acted quickly. Too quickly, perhaps. The library door opened quietly. Dr. Fielding entered. He looked shattered. "You should rest," he said gently. "My dear boy, elderly ladies do not rest during murder investigations. We become unbearable." A faint smile touched his face briefly before vanishing again. "I failed her." "No. I'm a doctor. You are human." He sat heavily opposite her. For several moments neither spoke. Then Miss Marple said quietly, "You cared about her." Fielding looked surprised. "Elsie?" "She was a good girl. Not love, then." "Almost brotherly, perhaps." Miss Marple studied him carefully. "You knew something troubled her." "What?" Fielding hesitated. "At first I thought she was simply frightened by the murder, and later she asked strange questions." "What sort?" "About memory, about whether trauma could make people imagine things." Miss Marple became very still. "Imagine what?" "She wouldn't say." Fielding rubbed tiredly at his eyes. "But she kept speaking about the greenhouse." "Of course she did. Everything returned there eventually." Miss Marple asked softly, "Did Elsie know who her parents were?" The doctor blinked. "Orphan, perhaps?" "Yes, I think so." "Why?" Miss Marple did not answer immediately. "Because another shape had formed suddenly in her thoughts. Not complete yet, but close. Very close indeed." At dawn Inspector Hewitt assembled everyone remaining in the drawing-room. Grey, exhausted light filtered through the curtains. No one had slept. Arthur Wexley sat rigid beside the fireplace. Vivian Harcourt looked pale but composed by sheer force of will. Dr. Fielding stood near the windows, and Miss Marple knitted quietly in the corner. Inspector Hewitt addressed them grimly. Miss Turner was murdered shortly after telephoning Miss Marple for help. No one spoke. She was strangled manually. No sign of forced entry. Meaning, thought Miss Marple. She knew her killer. Hewitt continued. She also left this note. He held up the paper. They lied too. What lies? He demanded sharply. About Alice Dorr? Thomas Briggs? What did the girl know? Then, unexpectedly, Vivian spoke. Perhaps she discovered something in the greenhouse. Inspector Hewitt turned toward her instantly. Such as? I don't know. But Miss Marple noticed the hesitation, yet present, and suddenly she understood something important. Vivian was frightened not merely of the murderer, but of a particular truth emerging. Arthur spoke abruptly. This has gone far enough. Hewitt rounded on him. Meaning? Search the entire house if necessary. Question everyone again, but stop circling endlessly. The inspector's expression hardened. You sound nervous, Mr. Wexley. I am nervous. At last, some honesty. Arthur rose violently. My father buried a body beneath the greenhouse. A man was murdered on my property 20 years ago. Another girl just died in this house. Of course I'm nervous. The raw anguish in his voice silenced the room completely, and Miss Marple thought suddenly, number, not the killer. And Miss Marple thought suddenly, number, not the killer. Cowardly, perhaps. Weak, perhaps, but not this. Then another realization arrived almost immediately afterward, so sudden it nearly took her breath. Elsie's note. They lied too. Not he lied. Plural. More than one person had concealed the truth 20 years earlier. Miss Marple's knitting slipped from her lap. Inspector Hewitt noticed instantly. What is it? Slowly, Miss Marple looked toward the rain-dark windows beyond which the greenhouse stood faintly visible through mist, then toward Arthur Wexley, then toward Vivian, finally toward Dr. Fielding, and very softly she said, I believe we have misunderstood the original crime entirely. Silence followed. Inspector Hewitt stepped forward. What do you mean? Miss Marple folded her hands carefully. I think Thomas Briggs may not have been the only person who fell from that gallery. For several seconds nobody spoke. Rain whispered faintly against the drawing-room windows while the pale dawn light slowly strengthened across the carpets. Inspector Hewitt stared at Miss Marple. That makes no sense. Oh, I think it does, said Miss Marple gently. Arthur Wexley looked exhausted beyond resistance. My father said Alice slipped. Yes, replied Miss Marple softly. But your father lied about one death already. The room grew very still. Miss Marple continued knitting calmly. One notices certain peculiarities in stories that are repeated too long. They become smoothed at the edges, simplified. Inspector Hewitt folded his arms impatiently. Then explain plainly. Very well. Miss Marple set down her knitting. Thomas Briggs discovered the affair between Alice Dorr and Mr. Wexley's father. Arthur shut his eyes briefly. There was an argument inside the greenhouse during a storm. Briggs fell from the upper gallery. Or was pushed, said Hewitt sharply. Possibly. Miss Marple inclined her head slightly. But afterward something else happened. Her eyes moved slowly toward the greenhouse beyond the windows. Alice arrived. Silence settled more deeply now. She found Thomas Briggs dead, Miss Marple said quietly, and she saw who killed him. Inspector Hewitt frowned. So they silenced her too? Vivian whispered. My God! Arthur stared at Miss Marple with horror. No! My dear, said Miss Marple gently, your father concealed one body beneath the greenhouse floor. Why should we assume he stopped there? Arthur looked physically sick now. Inspector Hewitt began pacing rapidly. Then why invent the story of suicide afterward? Because it was useful. How? Miss Marple folded her hands. A pregnant servant girl dying accidentally during emotional distress is tragic but manageable socially. Understanding dawned slowly across the inspector's face. But a witness murdered deliberately would have destroyed everything. Outside, thunder rolled faintly again beyond the hills. Dr. Fielding stood utterly motionless near the window, and Miss Marple turned toward him gently. Your mother suspected this, didn't she? Fielding answered after a long pause. She believed Alice was murdered because she knew too much. Inspector Hewitt wheeled sharply. And you never told us? The doctor laughed bitterly. Would you have believed childhood stories from a grieving woman? No one answered, because perhaps they would not have. Miss Marple said softly, Yet someone else did know. Everyone looked at her. Elsie Turner? Vivian frowned. But how? Miss Marple's eyes narrowed thoughtfully. "That is the final difficulty." She rose slowly. "My dear Inspector, I should like to visit the servants' quarters." Elsie Turner's small attic room overlooked the rear gardens of Greyfriars. Rain misted softly against the narrow window panes, while Inspector Hewitt searched drawers with growing frustration. "Nothing," he muttered. The room appeared painfully ordinary. Neatly folded dresses, a worn hairbrush, several library books, and upon the bedside table a framed photograph of a middle-aged woman Miss Marple did not recognize. She picked it up gently. "Who is this?" The housekeeper answered quietly from the doorway. "Her aunt, I believe." "Her aunt?" Elsie was raised by her after childhood. Miss Marple examined the photograph carefully. The woman possessed a familiar shape around the eyes, not beauty precisely, recognition. A memory stirred faintly. Then Miss Marple crossed suddenly toward the wardrobe. Inside hung Elsie's clothing in careful rows, plain dresses, a dark green coat. Miss Marple became very still. Dark green, exactly the shade of the missing button found near the greenhouse door. Inspector Hewitt saw her expression instantly. "What is it?" Without answering, Miss Marple touched the coat sleeve gently. "One button missing." Silence filled the little attic room. Vivian whispered, "Oh, no!" Inspector Hewitt's face hardened. She was the intruder. "Yes," said Miss Marple quietly. "But why?" Miss Marple continued studying the coat. Not panic now, not confusion, understanding. At last the pieces aligned. Slowly she turned back toward them all. Because Elsie Turner was Thomas Briggs's granddaughter. The shock in the room was palpable. Arthur Wexley sank weakly onto the bed. Dr. Fielding stared outright. Inspector Hewitt said sharply, "How can you know that?" Miss Marple held up the framed photograph. "The resemblance, also the timing." She spoke very gently now. Elsie was too young to remember the original deaths personally, but she was raised by family who did. Vivian covered her mouth. "She came here deliberately." "To investigate?" "Perhaps at first." Miss Marple's gaze drifted toward the rain-blurred greenhouse below. "But I think something changed." Inspector Hewitt frowned. "Why?" "She discovered the truth." A silence followed. Miss Marple continued quietly. "The anonymous letters were not written by Elsie." "Then who wrote them?" demanded Hewitt. "I believe," said Miss Marple slowly, "they were written by Lionel Crewe himself." Everyone stared. Arthur spoke hoarsely. "That's impossible." "No." Miss Marple's voice remained calm. "Crewe had lived for decades upon fear and secrecy. But recently he realized someone else had begun searching the greenhouse, someone connected to the past." "Elsie," whispered Fielding. Inspector Hewitt shook his head. "Why send letters to himself? To create confusion. Drama, control." Miss Marple looked toward Arthur. He wished everyone frightened and unstable while negotiating fresh blackmail payments. Arthur closed his eyes miserably. "Yes," he whispered. "That sounds like him." Miss Marple nodded. "But Crewe made one mistake." "What mistake?" asked Hewitt. "He underestimated Elsie." Rain beat harder suddenly against the attic window. She entered the greenhouse repeatedly searching for evidence about Thomas Briggs. Eventually she discovered the hidden chamber beneath the floor. Inspector Hewitt frowned. But she never exposed it, because by then she had discovered something worse. Miss Marple's voice softened. She learned Thomas Briggs did not simply disappear. "He was murdered," said Vivian quietly. "And Alastor witnessed it," added Fielding. Miss Marple inclined her head. "Exactly." Inspector Hewitt paced restlessly. "That still doesn't explain Lionel Crewe's murder." "No," said Miss Marple softly. "But now we approach it." She looked carefully around the room. At Arthur Wexley, Vivian Harcourt, Julian Fielding. 3 frightened people carrying different burdens, and among them, one person whose fear had always been slightly wrong. Not fear of exposure, not fear of inherited shame, but fear of discovery. Miss Marple folded her hands quietly. "Elsie telephoned me because she finally understood who killed Lionel Crewe." The room became utterly silent. Inspector Hewitt spoke carefully now. "And who was that?" Miss Marple turned slowly toward the doorway, where the butler stood frozen beside the housekeeper, watching, listening, quiet as he had always been, invisible as servants often became. Miss Marple's eyes rested gently upon him, and very softly she said, "Mr. Graves, perhaps you should sit down." For one suspended moment nobody moved. Rain struck steadily against the attic windows, while the old house seemed to settle around them with faint creaks and whispers from distant corridors. Mr. Graves remained standing in the doorway. He was a tall man in his late 50s, spare and impeccably composed, with silvering hair and the kind of expression servants cultivated after decades spent observing without reacting. Only now, for the first time, something had altered. Not panic, not surprise, weariness, deep weariness. Inspector Hewitt stepped forward immediately. "What is the meaning of this, Miss Marple?" Miss Marple did not take her eyes from the butler. "My dear Inspector, one eventually notices a curious thing about old houses." No one spoke. "The servants know everything." Mr. Graves gave a faint, sad smile. "Yes," he said quietly, "they generally do." Arthur Wexley stared. "Graves?" The butler looked toward him almost kindly. "You are a child, sir." Inspector Hewitt's voice hardened. "You'd better start explaining immediately." Mr. Graves entered the room slowly and closed the door behind him. "I was a footman here when Thomas Briggs died." Silence thickened instantly. Miss Marple watched him carefully. Unlike Arthur Wexley, Graves showed no collapsing fear. Unlike Dr. Fielding, no inherited grief. Unlike Vivian, no emotional turmoil. Only exhaustion. The exhaustion of someone who had carried memory too long. Inspector Hewitt folded his arms. "You witnessed what happened." Arthur whispered, "My father—" "He argued with Briggs in the greenhouse." Graves' voice remained calm, almost detached now. "Mr. Briggs threatened scandal, said he intended to expose the affair with Alice publicly. And then?" asked Hewitt. "There was pushing. Briggs fell from the upper gallery." "Murder?" A pause. The word settled heavily into the room. Arthur sat staring at nothing. Miss Marple said softly, "And Alice arrived afterward." Graves closed his eyes briefly. "Yes, she saw the body. And your employer decided she—" "Yes, she saw the body. And your employer decided she must be silenced." "No." The answer came sharply enough to surprise them all. Inspector Hewitt narrowed his eyes. "No?" Graves shook his head slowly. "Mr. Wexley panicked. He wanted the police called. It was Lionel Crewe who insisted otherwise." "Interesting," thought Miss Marple. "Very interesting indeed." "Crewe arranged the concealment," she said quietly. "Yes." "And Alice?" The butler's face altered faintly then. Pain. Real pain. "She ran." Everyone stared. "She fled up the greenhouse stairs after seeing Briggs below. Crewe followed her." Miss Marple felt cold suddenly despite the warmth of the attic room. "She did not fall accidentally." "No," said Graves softly. "Crewe cornered her." Arthur made a broken sound. Inspector Hewitt spoke grimly. "And pushed her." The rain seemed louder now somehow, more intimate. Miss Marple closed her eyes briefly. So simple in the end. Not passion, not rage. Convenience. The worst crimes often came from convenience. Inspector Hewitt's voice became dangerously quiet. "You concealed all this for 20 years. Why?" Graves looked toward Arthur Wexley. "Because his father threatened to ruin every servant in the house if we spoke, and you obeyed." "I was young," Miss Marple said gently. "And later?" Graves' composure faltered slightly. "Later, it was too late." "Yes," thought Miss Marple. That was the terrible thing about silence. Years transformed cowardice into permanence. Inspector Hewitt stepped nearer. "This explains the past, not the recent murders." "No," said Graves quietly. "Those are my fault." A stillness swept the room. Arthur stared. "What?" Miss Marple already knew, or nearly knew. "You wrote the anonymous letters," she said softly. "Why?" The butler looked suddenly old. "Because Crewe began blackmailing Arthur again." Arthur closed his eyes. "He said he needed money." "No," replied Graves bitterly. "He needed power." Inspector Hewitt frowned. "So you tried frightening him." "The messages, the telephone call, the chalk writing." Graves nodded once. "I wanted him to stop." Miss Marple spoke gently. "But you did not kill him." For the first time Graves looked directly at her. "No." Inspector Hewitt snapped. "You expect us to believe that?" "It's the truth." "Convenient. I met him in the greenhouse that afternoon," Graves admitted quietly. "I intended to force him to leave Greyfriars forever." "And?" "He laughed at me." Miss Marple could imagine Lionel Crewe laughing very easily indeed. "What happened then?" she asked. "I left him alive." Inspector Hewitt's eyes narrowed. "Can anyone confirm that?" "No." "Of course not." Graves lowered his head briefly. "But I did not stab him." Silence followed. Then Miss Marple said softly, "Elsie discovered your letters." "Yes." "She realized you knew the truth about Alice. And later she discovered something else." Graves looked up sharply. Miss Marple watched him steadily. She recognized the real murderer. For the first time since entering the room, genuine fear crossed the butler's face. Inspector Hewitt noticed instantly. "What does she mean?" But Graves said nothing. Miss Marple folded her hands quietly. "My dear Mr. Graves, you made one very human mistake." The butler looked exhausted now. "What mistake?" "You assumed the murderer killed Crewe for the same reasons you wanted him frightened." Outside thunder rolled softly again across the distant hills. "But the person who killed Lionel Crewe," Miss Marple continued, "was not protecting Arthur Wexley, not protecting old scandal, not protecting Greyfriars, protecting themselves." Inspector Hewitt stared at her. Miss Marple turned slowly toward Dr. Julian Fielding. The young doctor had gone utterly pale. "No," whispered Vivian, but Miss Marple's eyes remained fixed upon him. "You did not know about Thomas Briggs," she said quietly. "That part was true." Fielding stared back at her silently. "But you discovered something else recently." No answer. "You learned Lionel Crewe had murdered Alice Dorr." The doctor's face tightened visibly. "My mother always believed." "Yes," interrupted Miss Marple gently, "but belief is not certainty." She took one step forward. "Then Crewe confirmed it himself." Fielding looked away, and in that instant everyone understood. Inspector Hewitt's voice hardened. "You confronted him." "Yes," said Fielding at last, barely audible. The room held its breath. Fielding laughed once softly, a dreadful, exhausted sound. "He admitted it," Vivian whispered. "Oh, Julien." The doctor closed his eyes. "He said Alice had been hysterical. He said pushing her was necessary." Miss Marple felt a deep sadness then, because now at last the emotional pattern aligned completely. Not cold calculation, not greed. Grief inherited like poison. Fielding opened his eyes again. "I went to the greenhouse intending only to frighten him." Inspector Hewitt spoke grimly. "But you killed him." The word fell quietly, almost gently. Fielding's shoulders sagged. "He mocked my mother, mocked Alice, and suddenly he swallowed hard. I realized he'd never stop hurting people." Vivian covered her face. Arthur stared numbly into space. Miss Marple said softly, "The gardening knife was nearby." Fielding nodded. "I hardly remember picking it up." Inspector Hewitt stepped forward slowly. "And Elsie?" Pain crossed Fielding's face instantly. "I didn't kill Elsie." Miss Marple believed him, completely. And suddenly, terribly, she knew the final truth. Not one murderer. She turned very slowly toward Mr. Graves. The old butler stood utterly motionless beside the door. But his eyes had closed. No one in the attic room spoke for several seconds. Rain drifted softly against the windows now, gentler than before, as though the storm itself had exhausted its anger. Yet inside the room the silence felt unbearable. Inspector Hewitt turned slowly toward Mr. Graves. "What does she mean?" The butler did not answer immediately. His face had become curiously empty, not defensive, not frightened, merely resigned. Miss Marple spoke very quietly. "Elsie Turner discovered more than the truth about Lionel Crewe." Vivian lowered her hands from her face. "She discovered Mr. Graves wrote the letters." "Yes," said Miss Marple, "and she understood why." Inspector Hewitt frowned sharply. "But if Fielding killed Crewe, then why would Graves?" "Because," said Miss Marple softly, "Mr. Graves believed Elsie would expose everything publicly." The butler closed his eyes briefly. Arthur Wexley stared in disbelief. "No." Graves looked toward him sadly. "I could not allow another scandal to destroy the house." Inspector Hewitt exploded. "Another scandal? A girl is dead." "Yes," whispered Graves. "And that is my burden." The words settled heavily over them all. Graves. "And that is my burden." The words settled heavily over them all. Miss Marple felt suddenly very old, not physically, spiritually, because beneath every murder there always came this moment, the dreadful smallness of human motives after all the fear and secrecy. Inspector Hewitt stepped nearer the butler. "You strangled Elsie Turner." Vivian gave a broken gasp. Dr. Fielding stared at Graves in horror. The butler's voice remained calm. "She telephoned Miss Marple because she realized the anonymous letters came from me. She confronted me in the morning room. And she said the truth had to come out." Inspector Hewitt's face hardened. "So you silenced her." Graves looked suddenly ancient. "I had spent 20 years protecting Greyfriars, protecting Arthur from his father's sins, protecting everyone from ruin." His voice trembled faintly for the first time. "And suddenly another child stood there demanding everything be destroyed again." Miss Marple said softly, She reminded you of Alice. The butler's composure broke at last. Only one word, but inside it lay 2 decades of guilt. Rain whispered against the attic glass. Far below in the house a clock chimed faintly through distant corridors. Inspector Hewitt drew a slow breath. "You'll come downstairs now." Graves nodded once. No resistance, no denial. Merely surrender. As the inspector led him toward the door, the old butler paused beside Arthur Wexley. "I am sorry, sir," he said quietly. Arthur looked at him with hollow eyes. "For what?" Graves hesitated. "For teaching you that silence was kindness." Then he left the room. By evening the rain had stopped completely. Greyfriars Hall stood beneath a pale clearing sky while police motorcars departed slowly down the gravel drive. The house seemed emptied somehow, not quieter exactly, simply stripped. Secrets once buried beneath the greenhouse floor now lay fully exposed to daylight. Miss Marple sat in the drawing-room beside the fading fire while Inspector Hewitt prepared to leave. "Well," he said heavily, "you were right again. My dear Inspector, that sounds dangerously like praise." He almost smiled. 2 murderers in one case. Fielding killed Crewe from rage. "And grief," Miss Marple added gently. Hewitt nodded reluctantly. "And Graves killed Elsie to preserve the old lies." The inspector stared into the fire. "Strange thing is, neither began as wicked people." Miss Marple folded her hands quietly. "That is the tragedy." Outside the windows twilight gathered softly across the gardens. The greenhouse stood faintly visible beyond the lawn, its glass panes glowing silver beneath the last traces of evening. Inspector Hewitt followed her gaze. "I suppose they'll tear it down now." "Perhaps. You disapprove?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "My dear man, buildings are innocent. Human beings merely use them badly." The inspector considered this. Then, after a moment, he said quietly, "Do you pity Fielding?" "Yes." "And Graves?" Miss Marple's knitting needles paused. "Yes," she said again. "Though pity alters nothing." Number. The dead remained dead. Alice Dorr, Thomas Briggs, Lionel Crewe, Elsie Turner. Lives ruined by fear, pride, secrecy, and the desperate human belief that truth can remain buried forever. Inspector Hewitt collected his hat. "You know," he muttered, "I shall never look at greenhouses comfortably again." "That is probably wise." For the first time in days the inspector laughed softly. Then he departed into the evening. 3 days later Rose Hill began slowly returning to itself. Villages recover because they must. The bakery reopened ordinary arguments about bread prices. The vicar resumed worrying about roof repairs. Mrs. Finch discovered fresh scandals unrelated to murder. Yet something lingered still around Greyfriars Hall. A scar, perhaps. Arthur Wexley announced privately that he intended to leave the estate for a time. Vivian Harcourt remained beside him. Not dramatically, not romantically, simply loyally. Dr. Julian Fielding confessed fully and awaited trial with quiet resignation. Miss Marple visited him once before he was transferred. "You hate me now," he said without looking at her. "No," replied Miss Marple gently. "You should." "My dear boy, hatred is rarely useful." Fielding stared at his hands. "I thought killing him would free my mother somehow." Miss Marple's expression softened sadly. "But the dead do not become peaceful because more death follows." He closed his eyes. "No." When she rose to leave, he said quietly, "Thank you for understanding." Miss Marple paused beside the door. Understanding, she reflected afterward, was sometimes the saddest thing in the world. A week later, Miss Marple walked once more beside the greenhouse at dusk. The orchids had already begun to wilt without proper care. Several panes remained cracked from the recent storms. The place no longer seemed frightening, only tired. She paused beside the rear wall where the chalk message had once appeared. "Alice knows." "Yes," Miss Marple murmured softly to herself. In the end she did. The evening breeze stirred faintly through the gardens. Far away church bells drifted across Rose Hill. And slowly, gently, life moved on.